Good afternoon. I'm Jay Williams. Um, is the volume okay for everybody? Okay, yeah. Well, thank you for coming out to share with me 12 short poems by my favorite poet, Wendell Berry. I'm assuming that most of you probably have some familiarity with Wendell Berry, or you wouldn't be here today. But I am going to give you a short biographical summary to put the poems in some context. If you asked Wendell Berry, who is Wendell Berry, he would probably say that he's an 89-year-old Kentucky farmer who farms with a horse-drawn plow on the same acreage that his family has farmed for at least 5 generations in Henry County, Kentucky, which is on the Kentucky River near its junction with the Ohio River. He would also probably tell you that he's something of an introvert and a homebody, and that he prefers the company of his family and the farmers who are his neighbors. If you asked literary critics who Wendell Berry is, they would tell you that he is a national treasure who has written volumes of poetry, novels, and essays, and that he is an important voice in the environmental movement as well. Now, he's also very popular with Christian theologians, which is somewhat ironic because I don't think he darkens the door of a church very often, but he has written a whole series of Sabbath poems. He observes the Sabbath, but his preferred way of doing so is riding on horseback around the fields and woods of his home. His poetry is replete with themes of birth, death, and resurrection as manifested in the seasons of the crops and the natural world and the woods. And his novels are filled with characters like Jayber Crow, who are entirely human and flawed and always seeking and usually finding redemption. Um, my Presbyterian pastor of 26 years could not get through a month of sermons without quoting Wendell Berry at least once. Um, Now, a couple of things about Wendell Berry's life to sort of put him in perspective. Um, he was early in his literary influence goes well beyond rural Kentucky. As a young man, he was a Wallace Stegner Fellow in the Stanford Writing Seminar, where, of course, he studied with the late Wallace Stegner, who is arguably the greatest modern American writer who concerned himself with the American West, with his books Angle of Repose and others. But also in that same seminar group were some then young writers who later went on to become very well known, including Ken Kesey of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Edward Abbey of Desert Solitaire, and most importantly to Wendell Berry, Ernest Gaines of the autobiography of Miss Jean Pittman and A Lesson Before Dying and The Company of Old Men. He and Berry were lifelong friends until Gaines' death in 2019. And one of the things that Berry wrote to Gaines in one of his letters was, I have always felt an affinity for you because we both grew up spending evenings on the front porch listening to the wisdom of the old people. Another thing that is noteworthy about the Berry family more recently is that they have become great champions of Berea College in Berea, Kentucky, which was the first coeducational private college in the South to become integrated, and according to a recent New York Times article, is the most economically diverse college or university in the country, with something like 40% of its student body attending on Pell Grants. So I have selected 12 poems that I think illustrate different themes that Barry writes about. The first of those is the importance of family, and I'm going to begin with 3 very sweet poems dedicated to his late wife, Tanya. The first of these is called Over the Edge. To tell a girl you loved her, my God, that was a leap off a cliff, requiring little sense, sweet as it was. And I have loved many girls, women too, who by various fancies of my mind have seemed lovable. But only with you have I actually tried it. The long labor, the selfishness, the self-denial, the children, the grandchildren, the garden rose planted and gathered, the births and deaths of many years. We boys, when we were young and romantic and ignorant, new to the mystery of the power, would wonder late into the night on the cliff's edge, was this love real? Was it true? And how would you know? Well, it was time would tell, if you were patient and could spare the time. A long time, a lot of trouble, a lot of joy. This one begins to look, would you say, real? This next one is called The Blue Robe, and I always get choked up reading this one. How joyful to be together, alone as when we first were joined in our little house by the river long ago. Except that now we know each other as we did not then. And now, instead of 2 stories fumbling to meet, we belong to one story that the 2 joining made. And now we touch each other with the tenderness of mortals who know themselves. How joyful to feel the heart quake at the sight of a grandmother, old friend in the morning light, beautiful in her blue robe. And the final one about his marriage is called Accept. Now that you have gone and I'm alone and quiet, my contentment would be complete if I did not wish you were here so I could say, how good it is, Tanya, to be alone and quiet. Another theme that runs throughout Barry's work is attachment to place. This is a poem called To Den. Den is Barry's grandson. We have walked so many times, my boy, over these old fields, given up to thicket, have thought and spoken of their possibilities, theirs and ours and theirs the same. So many times that now when I walk here alone, the thought of you goes with me. My mind reaches toward yours across the distance and through time. No mortal mind's complete within itself, but minds must speak and answer, as ours must, on the subject of this place, our history here, summoned as we are to the correction of old wrong in the soil, thinned and broken, and in our minds. You have seen on these gullied slopes the piles of stones, mossy with age, dragged out of furrows long ago by men now names on stones, who cleared and broke these fields, saw them go to ruin, learned nothing from the trees they saw return to hold the ground again. But here is a clearing we have made at no cost to the world and to our gain, a re-clearing. The theme of death and resurrection is one that runs through Barry's poetry, and this is a poem about a dog. The eager dog lies strange and still, who roamed the woods with me. Then while I stood and or climbed the hill or sat under a tree, awaiting what more time might say, he thrashed in undergrowth, pursuing what he scared away, made ruckus for us both. He's dead. I go more quiet now, stillness added to me by time and sorrow, mortal law by loss of company that his new absence has made new. Though it must come to doom, this quiet comes by kindness too, and brings me nearer home. For as I walk the wooded land, the morning of God's mercy, beyond the work of mortal hand, seen by more than I see, the quiet deer look up and wait, held still in quick and grace, and I wait, stop footstep and thought, we stand here face to face. Now, this is a poem about the two very different lives that Wendell Berry lives as a well known author and as a reclusive Kentucky farmer. I have again come home through miles of sky, from hours of abstract talk in the way of modern times, when humans live in their minds and the world, forgotten, dies into explanations. Weary with absence, I return to earth. Good to see you back down on the creek, Morton Rowan Berry would say, if he were here to say it, as he'll not be again. I have departed and returned too many times to forget that after all returns, one departure will remain. I bring the horses down off the hillside, harness them, and start the morning's work, the team quick to the load along the narrow road. I am weary with days of travel, with poor sleep, with time and error, with every summer's heat and blood-drinking flies, and yet I sink into the ancient happiness of slow work in unhastenable days and years. Horse and cow, plow and hoe, grass to graze and hay to mow, have brought me here and taught me where I am. I work in absence not yet mine, that will be mine. In time, this place has come to signify the absence of many and always more who once were here. Day by day, their voices come to me as from the air. I remember them in what I do, so I am not a modern man. In my work, I would be known by forebears of 1,000 years if they were here to see it. So it has been, so be it. Barry's angriest poems are his poems about how we're destroying the environment and community. Some of these rants include his reference to himself as the mad farmer. Here is one such angry rant. As if suddenly little towns where people once lived all their lives in the same houses now fill with strangers who don't bother to speak or wave. Life is a lonely business. Gloss it over how you will. Plaster it over with politic bullshit as you please. Ours has been a brutal history, punishing without regret whatever or whomever belonged or threatened to belong in place, converting the land to poverty and money any way that was quickest. Now, after the long invasion of alien species, including our own, in a time of endangered species, including our own, we face the hard way. No choice but to do better. After the brief cataclysm of cheap oil and coal has long passed, along with the global economy, the global village. Now, here are two of his Sabbath poems. How long does it take to make the woods? As long as it takes to make the world. The woods is present as the world is, the presence of all its past and of all its time to come. It is always finished, it is always being made, the act of its making forever greater than the act of its destruction. It is a part of eternity, for its end and beginning belong to the end and beginning of all things, the beginning lost in the end in the beginning. What is the way to the woods, and how do you go there? By climbing up through the 6 days' field, kept in all the body's years, the body's sorrow, weariness, and joy, by passing through the narrow gate on the far side of the field, where the pasture grass of the body's life gives way to the high original standing of the trees, by coming into the shadow of the grace of the straight ways ending, the shadow of the mercy of light. Why must the gate be narrow? Because you cannot pass beyond it burdened. To come in among these trees, you must leave behind the 6 days' world, all of it, all of its plans and hopes. You must come without weapon or tool, alone, expecting nothing, remembering nothing, into the ease of sight, the brotherhood of eye and leaf. And this is another untitled Sabbath poem, which is also a tribute to Barry's late best friend, Art Rowan Barry. That's been an oak tree a long time, said Arthur Rowan Barry. How long a time we did not know. The oak meant, as Art meant, that we were lost in time, in which the oak and we had come and would go. Nobody knows what to make of this. It was as if there in the Sabbath morning light, we both were buried or unborn while the oak lived, or it would fall while we stood. But Art, who had the benefit of not too much education, not too many days pressed between pages or framed in a schoolhouse window, is long fallen now, though he stands in my memory still as he stood in time or stands in heaven. And a few of his memories remain a while as memories of mine. To be on horseback with him and free, lost in time, found in place, early Sunday morning was plain delight. We had ridden over all his farm, along field edges, through woods, in search of ripe wild fruit, and found none for all our pains. And yet, we didn't find what we were looking for, said Arthur Rowan Barry, pleased, but haven't we seen some fine country? And probably Barry is best known for his many poems about the peace of the woods and going into the woods. I'm going to read 2 of those. The first one is called Camp Branch. Little stream, Camp Branch, flowing through the ever-renewing woods on the steep slopes, by what name did the Shawnee call you? We live briefly in time, longer than we will live to know. When we who know you by name are gone, what will they call you? When our nation has fallen, as all things fall, when the Constitution is only another paper god, prayed to and lied to by another autocrat, what will they call you? When our kind has gone, as all things go, and you remain, your tumbles catching and returning light to the air as beautifully as before, will only the angels name you and praise you then? And finally, this is one of Barry's best-known poems called The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Thank you. I'd be glad to entertain any comments or questions that you might have. Um, there's only one of these that involves rhyme, although there's a piece of a couple others that's rhyming. So um, uh, they are written in a form that is not a linear prose form, but rather is line upon line. Um, Judy Joe, maybe you can give a better answer to this than I can. Yeah. Hmm. 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 Yes, it's a poem, yeah. And it's not a matter of length because although I've just chosen short poems today, some of his poems are 75 pages long. You know? Yes. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. Oh gosh. It's the, the one that I'm thinking of is a Sabbath poem. And it's really a number of poems within a poem. There are sections, and each section has a slightly different focus. Yeah. His novels, incidentally, are all about the fictitious community of, I think he calls it Point Royal, although where he actually lives is Port Royal, but it's a river community in Kentucky, much like Faulkner's Yoktabanatha County, that is the setting for all of his novels, and the same group of characters are in each of the novels. My very favorite is called Jayber Crow. Um, and, as I mentioned before, Jayber was kind of a drifter who had many occupations and um, had many regrets about what he had and had not done with his life, but he finds redemption. And I will say on a personal note that my father grew up in a small community in southern Missouri. And when I was reading about this community, I thought, this is exactly the way my father grew up in this community where everybody knew everybody else. Everybody was a farmer, so had respect for the land and dependence on the land, and likewise had respect and dependence on the other members of that community. Yes. Yes. Right. Okay, Linda. Great. I appreciate that. Okay, thank you all very much for coming.